Hey everybody, and welcome to the first, well, I guess the first of the online lectures that I'm going to be providing on your recording courses. Now, this one is for ART and recording tools, because you've both been asking me a hell of a lot about the DIY recording, and we were going to have some lectures on these. However, obviously, a lot of our live recording stuff can't be done, so it's a really great time for me to actually get in and chat to you about kind of some of the magic of the DIY recording thing. I'm really excited to talk about this because it's one of my massive passions. You'll notice that I'm in a spaceship right now. That's because I really don't want you all seeing my bedroom. However, the reality is you're going to be seeing my bedroom at some point soon, which is really embarrassing for me, because for both ART and recording tools, I'm going to start moving into how to do bedroom recording, basically. So what we're going to be doing over the next few lectures as well, I've replaced kind of our big workshops with like kind of hacks and ways of doing really cool recordings that you can do in your bedroom, different things you can do to treat your space, all that sort of thing, so that you can actually still make amazing recordings. Now, I'm going to be putting out another video on how you can deal with your new assessments. So the assessments are not going to change much, so please don't freak out about that. The assessments are going to barely change at all. It's just in the case of the delivery system is going to obviously have to change slightly. So if you are presenting, you're going to have to film yourself, or little things like that. I just want to make sure you don't need to freak out about assessment, and I will be changing the assessment due dates as well, because obviously things are slightly different to what they used to be, and I don't want you all to feel absolute horrible pressure on that. Anyway, let's stop talking about the boring admin stuff and start talking about the fun stuff, which is the DIY recording. Okay, so DIY recording and building your sonic signature. So before we do this, I kind of want to go into what are the analog versus digital paradigms, which is kind of what does analog do better and what does digital do better. So I really just want to kind of think about this. So what does digital do better than analog? And in my opinion, we're going to be talking about kind of a hybrid approach where we kind of take both of these things and really think about what the strengths and weaknesses of both are. Now, to me, digital does precision better than analog. Precision is really important in this case. So I want to make sure that you understand that for me, the most important thing about digital is that it can do things that analog can't do. And one of the most important things is being precise. What does analog do better than digital? Now, to me, analog does color better than digital. So if you want something colorful, broad brush strokes and all that sort of fun stuff, then that's where kind of your analog starts coming in. Now, we're taking this from a tracking perspective. I don't want you to be thinking like mastering engineers, because if you're a mastering engineer, then yes, you definitely have plenty of precision analog that you can use, but it is incredibly expensive. And we're really talking kind of like more like the DIY sort of hybrid kind of community that's built around, home recording and all that sort of stuff. And there's a reason that I want to think about this, but I'll get to that a little later. So far, in the digital world, we've kind of got this wealth of analog clones that are basically taking up all of the big boys. So Universal Audio, Acoustica, Plug-in Alliance, T-Rax, and Slate Digital, Kush Audio, and Sli-Fi. Probably one of the more interesting ones out of those would be Kush Audio and Sli-Fi. I think they're actually really cool. So they kind of do weird analog piece recreations with digital stuff. I apologize if occasionally you just hear a on that. I'm using a small diaphragm condenser, so because, well, I'm a fool, and I like the pop sound every time that I say P. So Kush Audio and Sli-Fi, they do some really interesting things. The kind of most interesting ones to me is Sli-Fi, where these are plugins where the plugin developer has bought, say, an API EQ, for example, and then he's modified it. Then he's modeled that modified piece of API gear to create his own unique plugin. And I think that's kind of really cool. But probably one of the biggest ones for me is Plug-in Alliance, and we'll be talking about that a little bit later. But let's move along. So kind of my point here is that the big things have all already been covered. And it's really important to understand that the really big things are covered. So don't think about the big ones, because, I mean, all your basic flavors of your 1176, Plug-in Alliance, and UA have kind of covered most of it. The one that I've left off there is Waves, because I actually think they've fallen behind a little bit in the digital world. But let's move on to the fun stuff. So what gear is already covered? Your 1176s, your LA2As, your Fairchilds, and your tapes. So the question I'm asking here is, well, if that stuff's already covered, why would you even bother getting any kind of analog gear? So let's talk about the fun stuff. The thing about analog gear that I reckon is really cool, I said sounded like such an Aussie then, that I reckon is really cool. The thing about analog gear that I really love is that analog equipment, let me phrase that properly, is that the analog equipment I like is the analog equipment that you're never going to get you're never going to be cloned digital. So it's kind of a question of, like, why do I want to think about analog, and why do I want to think about analog and different kind of analog? Which brings me to the question of DIY analog and sort of quirky analog, and it brings me to the question of hybrid. And it's kind of, these are all sort of questions that rattle around in my head whenever I was thinking about, what do I want to build, what do I want to DIY, what do I want to get, why do I want analog, and what kind of analog do I want in my system? And to me, again, I'm going back to the fact that the thing that analog does best is color. The thing that digital does best is precision. So precision versus color. Now, I'm not going to build any analog that's entirely built around precision. So I want kind of the messy, colorful stuff, because I'm thinking about tracking. I'm not thinking about mixing and mastering. So why use hybrid and DIY? So hybrid systems are kind of, a lot of people develop hybrid systems specifically for speed. Console setups, if any of you have done a console recall yet, you'll notice that console setups are pretty intense. So you've got to really think a lot about whether your console is going to take hours and hours to set up before you've got to think about when you're doing any kind of mixing, when you're doing any kind of tracking. Consoles are awesome when you want to work fast and you have the space, but if you don't have a giant room and you don't have the time to deal with, like, taking down the recall and dealing with all of that fun stuff, then you're in trouble. So smaller hybrid systems that use a bridge of digital and a bridge of analog stuff are kind of quicker than console setups. They fit into much smaller spaces, so you can get them into smaller rooms. They're significantly more portable. This gives you the ability to get sort of what I would consider to be the thing that defines your unique sound. Now, I really want you to think long and hard about the fact that your unique sound is a thing that you are trying to create through that color. And again, what I'm saying here is color versus precision. Precision isn't getting you a unique sound, but color definitely is. Now, why DIY? Well, first, it means you can fix things. So it's really important to think about your ability to understand your gear on kind of a molecular level, and your ability to fix things is incredibly important. So just having the equipment, a soldering iron, a screwdriver, some resistors just lying around, little bits and pieces that you have there are your ability to not have to send equipment back to the manufacturer every time something breaks. I don't know if any of you have tried to send equipment back to a manufacturer in, say, Europe, for example, but if you're doing that, it's really painful. Whereas if it's literally just the amount of things that I've fixed that are just a little wire has popped off, and all I had to do was solder that wire back on. Like, I had two choices there. If I'm running a small studio, do I want a piece of equipment that's out of action while I send it back to Europe and then wait for it to come back, and for them to say, yeah, we just soldered that little wire back on? So usually with a visual check with any of my equipment, I can go, oh, that's broken. How can I fix that? Oh, it's just a wire. Well, in that case, I'll just solder that wire back and see if that's the problem. If it's not the problem, I can still always send it off and go, can you fix the mess I've made? But I prefer not to do that. So DIY is kind of about fixing gear, but there's another thing about DIY that I haven't actually written in this slideshow that's kind of really important, which is DIY is a really fun way to get to know your equipment on a molecular level. And we're going to go down to the tiniest little details of DIY today so that you can kind of understand what DIY equipment can do for you and why that matters. Now, on the other thing is like hybrid systems, like people like Brouwer and Sylvia Massey, they're all using hybrid systems, and like one of the saddest things I've ever seen is both Brouwer and Sylvia Massey have gotten rid of their consoles because they were finding their consoles were taking too long to recall, so they weren't getting mix changes out to people as quickly as possible. So with some hybrid equipment, they have kind of redesigned their entire mixing system to make sure that they can still get what they want out of the analog, but they've kind of reduced down their analog footprint from a console to a bunch of like mobile gear that they can move around a lot easier, and that they can be able to kind of jump in and out of mixes, so that they're still getting analog, but they can kind of open and close mixes at will. All right, let's moving along. So how do I approach analog, and what do I think about analog? To me, analog is about recording out of your interface back into your DAW. Now, what I'm trying to say here when I say recording out of your interface and back into your DAW, I'm going to talk about specific tracks. So there are different ways that we can mix, there are different ways we can influence our sound, and we've been doing this in both sound toys and in both recording tools, sound toys, in both recording tools and advanced recording techniques, which is you can record something clean, then you can run it back out and run it through some hardware and run it back in. Now we can do that with guitar pedals, we can do that with reverb units, we can do that with compressors and EQs and all that sort of thing. But so there's one way of thinking about it is you can go, all right, I want to compress this bass, for example, I'll record it out in one channel and then I'll record it back into the DAW on a loop. The next one is sending. So I used to think that one of the ways I really like using my analog outboard is to create a 2-bus mix. So I send my mix bus out of 2 channels of my DAW, and I put it into some analog processing, then I record it back in and I monitor what is recording back in, so that I'm mixing through 2 channels of analog. And I've kind of used that to sort of replace what I needed to do with digital recording or any kind of console mixing that I was doing. So console mixing is amazing and it's really fun and it's really energetic, until an artist says to me, I want to change something. And I struggled very much just going straight to digital because I felt that I was missing something, and my way around it was I built these little tools that I could put on my analog mix bus, and I create this analog mix bus that I mix through, and that kind of gave me the thing that analog was doing, which is sort of that extra width, that extra depth, and that extra sort of height on the frequency spectrum as well. So those are some ways that I use my unique analog toys. Portability, like the ability to have a 500 series lunchbox, and we're going to talk a bit more about 500 series lunchbox later, but the ability to have a 500 series lunchbox and have a portable setup that you can bring into any studio, that you can take to any location. There's a lot of really cool DIY and hybrid tools that are amazing for just jumping in and out of studios, rooms, just different ways that you can keep your kind of sonic signature just in your own little box. And the idea that you can have your sonic signature in a box, to me, is actually a pretty amazing thing. Flexibility, toys that can do more than one thing. Now I just want to talk a little bit about one of the important features of approaching hybrid tools. When I buy any piece of unique analog, I am looking for something that I tend to look for something that does line level and mic level. And the reason I do that is that means that I can process line level stuff and I can process mic level stuff without having to jump around on the levels too much. So if I want to do 2-bus processing and I've got, say for example, a Neve preamp and it's got a line in, then I can send it out of the DAW into the Neve preamp in the line in without having to drop the level and bring it back up. So I don't have to use reamp boxes or anything crazy like that, which means that I can run things through preamps to kind of get that preamp color, so like that Neve color or that API style color, or let's just be a bit more generic about this and go British color or American color. So the ability to be able to record microphones with those kind of colors, or the ability to be able to run anything in and out through those things. Interface. So this is an interesting one to me. Let's move along to that, which is, if you have a variety of small interface tools, there are so many things that I have made over the years that make my life better when I am recording both in like the bedroom studio and in like bigger studios and things. And I still walk around with a little suitcase of interface tools like DI boxes, reamp boxes, and little pedals that do cool things. It's the best thing in the world to be able to just have this portable little interfacing setup where you don't have to deal with any of that rubbish. Hang on, sorry, I really didn't explain that very well. Where if you hit a wall in the recording session, then you have like this little Swiss Army knife of tools that can deal with that wall, and that's kind of useful, because the amount of times that I've gotten that I'm, say, in the university studios and it's late at night at QUT and our MRC in Australia had gone home, and then all of a sudden I'm like, oh no, I need a DI box, but I already had one because I brought one. It's kind of a really important thing just to have a few spares of these cool little interface toys, but they're particularly useful when you're at home, because when you're at home in your own bedroom studios, then you're able to use these sort of reamp boxes and DIs and all that sort of stuff to kind of expand the flexibility of some sort of a basic 2-channel thing. And we'll talk a bit more about that later when I get into those lectures. So getting started with DIY. One of the most important things to think about when you're getting started with DIY is what tools should you have. And I made this mistake myself. The first thing I ever built DIY was a DI box, just a tiny little DI box, because I thought I want to start with something simple. And I found out that I really needed some better tools. Now, soldering iron, get a decent soldering iron with a fine point. You will need a decent soldering iron with a fine point if you want to start doing any kind of DIY stuff. Get a cleaning scourer. Now, it's like a little gold sort of scourer that you just dip your that you kind of screw your soldering tip into to kind of clean it out and make sure that it doesn't become dirty. So it's a really good way to make sure that everything stays really clean. The next one is needle nose pliers with a really fine needle nose. That'll be really handy, because with DIY you find out really quickly that you're in all these tiny little spaces and you're trying to get around things, and it's almost impossible if you don't have those. Precision clippers really matter. So when you're trimming boards or when you're trimming any kind of wires or anything like that, then you need precision clippers so you can really kind of get in there. Small electronic screwdrivers of both kinds, so like the flat head and the Phillips heads. So for those of you that don't know, like the sort of star head, it's good to have very small electronic screwdrivers, because you're getting into tiny little things. Helping hands. So helping hands are like these little clip arms with a little magnifying glass. And to be honest, with the helping hands, the clip arms are useful enough so you can get it to just sort of hold up a circuit board while you're soldering something. But almost the more useful thing is having a magnifying glass, so you can actually look at what you've done and really kind of magnify it down and see if there are any bridging in if there's any bridging in your soldering, because it's almost impossible to see without that. So those are really important ones. Now, there's a couple of other things that I forgot to put on there because, well, I'm just not very smart. But one of the big ones is, what is it called? Resin cleaner. So, I've got to actually think about that, and I'll come back to that. But it's basically like a spray that you can spray on to clean your circuit board. So, circuit board cleaner. And I've forgotten what it's called. Of course, as soon as the camera's on, I just get all freaked out, and I've forgotten that completely. So, circuit board cleaner is really important. So it's just like a little spray, and it kind of just breaks down all of the flux that happens. Now, flux when you solder is like this sort of clear stuff. it's like almost like clear melted plasticky stuff that gets all over your circuit board while you're using your soldering iron. And what you need to be able to do is kind of spray that with a circuit board cleaner so that you can kind of, and then use a toothbrush to kind of scour off all of that sort of mess. And that will mean that your solder joints are clean, nothing is kind of bridging, and nothing kind of gets in, everything, all of your audio kind of passes a lot better through all of that. Okay, cool. So how do I start? Now that I've got the tools and I've got everything up and running, how do I start with any of this? Now, confidence building. First thing is mic cables. Mic cables and instrument cables. Build a guitar cable, build a microphone cable. They are unbelievably frustrating, and that's a good thing because they're heavy and they're annoying and they sit wrong, and that will kind of force you to kind of get yourself better. And you'll forget to put on the sleeve on the mic cable, and then once you've done that, so at the very end of this, I will put up all the resources for building mic cables, building instrument cables, and all that sort of stuff. Then the next one is so once you've figured out how to make mic cables, and you're making pretty good mic cables, and you can fix your old mic cables as well, fix your old instrument cables, like put new connectors on your old instrument cables, because usually it's the connector that's rubbish on an instrument cable. So once you've got good at making cables, and it's a frustrating start, move to a DI box or a reamp box. I'm going to show you those a little bit later, but a DI box is an incredibly simple circuit, and it's very easy to make, and you will have a really useful tool straight away. Like, I can't get enough of decent DI boxes. They're really useful, and you'll build up your confidence in that, and then you'll be like, wow, I got a tool really quickly. If you want to get into mics, get a ribbon mic kit, and I'll talk a little bit about those a bit later when I start talking about microphones. But a ribbon mic kit from Bumblebee Audio is incredibly easy to make. However, it's a little bit of a risk, because if you mis-solder something, so kind of your risk is definitely stepping up with a ribbon mic. If you mis-solder something, you can burn the ribbon, and if you burn the ribbon, then you're going to break the ribbon, and then you're going to have to send off for a new ribbon motor, which will be quite upsetting for you, I imagine. But just remember that it's a step up, so you're kind of taking a bit more risk when you start moving into a ribbon mic. Ribbon mics in themselves are incredibly simple devices. They are a ribbon built into a motor, which is two magnets on either side with a corrugated ribbon down the middle, and you solder that to a transformer, and you solder the transformer to an input jack, and that's it. And then you screw it all together. It's a very simple build, but it's one way you can do a lot more damage than a DI box. A DI box is a lot easier, and there's a lot less you can break on a DI box. From there, 500 series preamps are the next easiest things in the world to build. And once you've done a ribbon mic, a reamp box, a DI box, and a few mic cables, a preamp, you'll be scared of it at first, but once you've built one, you'll be like, oh wow, why did I have to worry about that? So that's kind of a really interesting one to think about. Then color modules and other preamps, color cards, and then once you get into it, there's a really cool little DIY Pultec, and I'm just going to click on that for you there. So if we flip to that, this is a DIY Pultec here. So it's actually not a particularly difficult build if you look at the actual. So you've got a integrated circuit here, you've got some resistors to put in there, you've got a couple of caps and things, so a couple of capacitors there. Not a giant ass capacitor there, that's kind of cool. A little bit of knob screwing around. So this is so for those of you that know your Pultecs, this is a Pultec, and it's a circuit. And then you can also do a thing where we do a vintage / modern output. At the moment you're looking at the modern output using one of these integrated circuits here, but you can actually change it to a discrete op amp here and a transformer, so you can have like a vintage style through hole output, and you can have an all discrete output as opposed to an integrated circuit output like this and this. Anyway, these are cool things that you can gradually build yourself, but let's move back into our PowerPoint so we can keep talking about this stuff. New analog and DIY are, to me, kind of a confluence of events. One of them is global communication. The other one is a mass of small designers. And the other one is an attitude like along the maker movement. So William Morris in the 1920s, there was a real backlash to what we would call ready-to-wear clothing, where a lot of people suddenly started going, well, there's this sort of movement of mass production. It's like the first mass production of clothing. And the immediate reaction to mass production of clothing was for people to go, well, I don't want mass production of clothing, so I'm going to start making my own clothes, and that's kind of how the maker movement spurred up. What's fascinating about that is it's a really kind of one of the early points where a community got really kind of sharing about their ideas and started like sharing clothing designs, sharing textile designs and things like that, so that they could all make their own unique things. And I found that the DIY pedal building, sort of these small companies that are making pedals, and these really interesting, I'm just going to have to close the curtain here a little bit so that it stops flapping around. That's better. One of the really interesting things that I found about the pedal community, that I found about the DIY community, is they all know each other and they all support each other and they're all friends with each other. I spent some time during my PhD actually interviewing a lot of these people, and they're all friends. And if one of them has trouble, then they call another one up and they all chat to each other. For example, the guy who's one of the original managing directors of the API, Paul Wolf, is friends with Jeff Steiger, who's the guy who does Cappy Gear, and he helps him out with his design. So the guy who invented the 2500 compressor is friends with the guy at Cappy Gear and helps him design some of his ideas, and they're mates. So one of the things I love about the DIY pedal building, sort of all this sort of community, is that everyone's kind of buddies, and it's very sort of idealistic to me. One of the big things that matters for this is the 500 rack, which is the no power supply. Now, for those of you who don't know what a 500 rack is, you can get a Lindell 500 rack 6-channel for relatively cheap, and you essentially have your power supply. Now, what's cool about this is because you don't have to build power supplies, you can start doing DIY stuff without the risk of hurting yourself. Now, of course, there's other communities like the synthesizer community and the pedal building community, but let's focus in more on sort of the 500 rack new sort of DIY stuff for now. Let's talk about the importance of the lunchbox. So in the 60s, this was developed by Saul Walker, who was the original owner of API. What were they called? Automated Products Incorporated, I believe API stands for. So the idea of this was not really, at the time, it was not the lunchbox that we know now. It was more the consoles with the slots for lunchboxes that we've all seen. Now, those consoles were specifically designed to be modular, and that's kind of one of the big reasons that API got really popular. So we can think of them as like building block consoles that are really simple things that you can just slide one thing out, slide another thing in. So you could, for example, you could think of it as preamps for one day, and then the next day you might need it for like EQs for mixing or something like that, and you can just switch them around. In 2006, there were a lot of basic lunchboxes, and there was a ton of stuff happening. So API actually had to create what they call the VPR Alliance, and that was launched to certify modules. So if a designer made a module, they had to make sure that that module was certified by VPR, and it was kind of like a, check your 500 module and make sure that it's certified so that you know that it's drawing the right amount of power. One of the problems that API Lunchboxes had in its early iterations is that all of the modules that were being built were built without consideration for the power requirements. So you kind of like had these modules that weren't working very well, which is kind of sucky if you get that, and then all of a sudden you're trying to work and your module's drawing too much power out of the rails of your API Lunchbox, and then all of a sudden something goes pop and starts smoking, and then you're like, oh great, cool, now it's just a smoking piece of nothing. So the really cool thing, though, is that API has become this platform for DIY because it has zero power requirements, and I think I mentioned that already. Cool. What are the drawbacks of the 500 series stuff? Well, first, it's small. any of you who've used any of the stuff down in Basement 3, you'll notice that it's a bit of a, especially in the dark, it's a bit of a pain in the butt to get your, try and get your hands around this sort of stuff. There are power issues, so you got to be really careful with what you're building, and that's not in terms of it's dangerous, by the way. You've just got to be careful that if you're building some of the bigger, more vintage spec Neve models, that it's likely that it may draw too much power and not work properly. So some of the vintage models might mean you have to leave a slot empty because it's going to draw enough power that your final slot won't have enough power. So you just got to be a little careful. Overheating, they get hot, and that can reduce the life of your equipment. So one of the most important things I find with any 500 series modules is if you're putting them in a rack, don't sandwich them together. Have at least one rack space of air in between them so air can escape, because otherwise the heat builds up and your equipment won't last as long, and then you'll be fixing your equipment all the time when just leaving a space could have kept things nice. Be careful swapping modules, of course. When you're pulling modules in and out, you can kind of knock components and you can knock them out. So you can, if you're really rough with them, or you do it in the dark or something like that, just be careful, because all of your parts on an API module are kind of just sticking out, and if you're pulling them out, you can knock a couple of parts and then you can ruin your module. Then you're going to have to fix it because you're a DIY person and you can fix it. The other, this is not really a drawback, but the drawback is API modules are a pain in the butt to calibrate because they're small and because you can't really look around corners. So if you can get around that by buying an extension ribbon for calibration. So when you slot an API into, it kind of slots in very much like a computer RAM slot or something like that. So you squeeze it in there. So one of the important things to think about is if you need to calibrate them, you'll need to turn these tiny little screws on the board. Now you can't do that when it's inside the 500 series module, but if you buy an extension ribbon, which is just basically an extension cord essentially for plugging you can have your module out, you can have it all turned on, and then you can do all your calibration, and you don't have issues with not being able to reach in and actually do some decent calibration. Cool. New and old. So we're really kind of going to go into some of the big people in this, but before we do that, maybe we'll take a 5-minute break and we'll move into part 2, where I actually start talking about all of the cool stuff that you can go. So that's kind of the end of the first half, where we're talking about the theory behind it, all the drawbacks, what's cool, why you do it, and all that sort of stuff. Now we want to kind of move into what are the cool people, and we're basically going to go, ooh, let's go gear shopping. So I'll see you back for that one. Take a 5-minute break, get yourself a cup of tea, and strap in. This is going to be fun.